Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a step back from the daily headlines to look at a truly pivotal moment in modern history, Iraq in 2003. We're going to dig into exactly why a decades-old regime collapsed so quickly, the profound consequences of dissolving the nation's military, and how the political shockwaves of that specific year literally reshaped the Middle East and the rest of the world. Okay, let's dive into this. Picture this, April 9, 2003. The eyes of the entire world were glued to Baghdad. TV cameras captured this incredibly dramatic, defining moment as the statue of Saddam Hussein in Firda Square was pulled to the ground. You know, for global audiences, the headline screamed that Iraq was liberated. It really felt like an ending, right? But for millions of Iraqis actually on the ground, this wasn't an ending at all. It was day one of a massive, incredibly volatile transformation. So, to really understand this transformation, we're going to track the events chronologically. We'll start with the collapse of the old regime, then look at the massive institutional vacuum it left behind. After that, we'll hit the catalyst of dissolving the military, the ensuing political repercussions, and finally, wrap up with the legacy and everyday life of regular citizens. All right, let's kick things off with part one, the collapse of the old regime.
Now, before the invasion even started, Iraq was a country under immense, crushing pressure. The government maintained absolute central control over both politics and the military. But honestly, beneath that iron grip, the nation was battered. Over a decade of harsh international sanctions had absolutely crippled the economy, leaving poverty and unemployment sky high. Against this really fragile backdrop, the U.S.-led coalition launched its invasion, and they had two main stated objectives: remove alleged weapons of mass destruction and execute regime change to establish a democracy.
The actual military campaign moved incredibly fast. On March 20th, the invasion officially begins. Coalition forces captured southern cities and pushed super quickly toward Baghdad. In just a matter of weeks, the Iraqi military resistance effectively collapsed. By April 9th, coalition troops were rolling into the capital, and the central government just lost its grip on power. But, here's the critical piece of the puzzle. When that government fell, absolutely no effective authority replaced it.
And this brilliantly illustrates our second part, the institutional vacuum. Essentially, a state vanishes. So, what happens when a state just vanishes? Well, you get a devastating breakdown of public order. Within days, widespread looting erupted everywhere. We're talking ministries and schools literally stripped down to the copper wiring in the walls. Over 15,000 priceless artifacts vanished from the Iraq Museum in this massive, heartbreaking cultural tragedy. But the true crisis was just basic survival. Police abandoned their posts, civil servants stayed home, and reliable electricity, water, and medicine, they simply evaporated. The institutions disappeared almost overnight.
Obviously, this led to a profound shift in the entire country's mood. The sudden absence of security meant that criminal gangs expanded rapidly, and various armed groups just began popping up. Imagine being a citizen during this time. Those initial moments of celebrating the end of a dictatorship, they were almost immediately replaced by this terrifying anxiety over personal safety. Just traveling between cities became incredibly dangerous. Businesses boarded up, and a lot of families just straight up refused to leave their homes after sunset.
So the crucial point is really part three, dissolving the military, which acted as a major catalyst for what followed. To try and manage this exploding crisis, the coalition established the Coalition Provisional Authority, or the CPA. This temporary administration was tasked with a monumental, highly ambitious mission. They needed to rebuild the country, restart a completely broken economy, and somehow prepare Iraq for self-government.
To achieve this fresh start, the CPA took some really controversial steps. First, they implemented what's known as de-Baathification, which essentially meant firing thousands of government workers and teachers tied to Saddam's ruling party. And then, crucially, they completely dissolved the entire Iraqi military. Now, supporters argued these purges were absolutely necessary, to prevent the old regime from making a comeback and to truly start fresh.
Now, what's really interesting here is the staggering gap between intent and reality. By dissolving the military, roughly 400,000 trained, armed men were suddenly made unemployed with just the stroke of a pen. Critics point out that this didn't just create an administrative nightmare, it instantly supplied a massive pool of frustrated, highly trained recruits for emerging insurgencies. This singular policy choice deeply fueled a security crisis that would plague the country for years to come.
This brings us to part four, the political repercussions and the entirely new landscape that emerged. So, amidst all this severe lack of security, Iraq was simultaneously undergoing an unprecedented political transition. For the first time in decades, new political parties could emerge out in the open.
Independent newspapers were suddenly popping up on the streets. Open political debates were happening everywhere. There was a concrete plan to actually draft a new constitution and organize democratic elections. I mean, these were tremendous democratic opportunities that had been entirely unthinkable under the previous authoritarian rule.
However, as you can probably guess, building entirely new democratic institutions from scratch is an enormous challenge, especially when you're doing it inside a power vacuum. On one hand, you had this really hopeful process of drafting a constitution, but on the other hand, different political groups were fiercely competing for influence. Without a strong, unifying central state, ethnic and religious divisions became increasingly visible and rigid. The political repercussions of 2003 basically meant that identity politics began to directly fill the void left by the fallen regime. And these political struggles were happening against a backdrop of severe economic dysfunction. Despite Iraq's massive oil wealth, production was continuously disrupted by sabotage and historical war damage. Factories stayed shuttered, stable work vanished, and everyday daily life was just squeezed by high inflation and shocking fuel shortages. International reconstruction projects were trying to get off the ground, but they were constantly paralyzed by the exact same insecurity the political transition was failing to solve.
Let's move to part 5 and see how this all builds into the everyday life and legacy of 2003. There's a great quote from one of our sources that says, "History was not experienced through political speeches or military operations. It was experienced through everyday life." And that's so true. It was parents terrified to send their kids to school. It was shop owners staying up all night guarding against looting. It was doctors trying to perform critical surgeries during relentless summer power outages. Citizens were caught in this brutal balancing act, holding on to the fragile hope that democracy would eventually deliver, while being totally paralyzed by the fear that this chaos could last for generations.
Fast forward to the end of 2003, and a major historical milestone hits the headlines. Saddam Hussein was captured. But on the ground, it wasn't a magic fix at all. His capture didn't immediately end the violence, the economic struggle, or the fierce political rivalries. Instead, it merely marked the end of the beginning, with years of grueling constitutional reform and complex security challenges still lying ahead.
Ultimately, the story of 2003 isn't just about a regime collapsing. It's about the highly volatile ingredients used to build a new one. The rapid dismantling of the military, the deep institutional void, and the rise of sectarian divisions completely rewired Iraqi society. 2 decades later, as we look at the modern Middle East, we really have to ask ourselves how much of today's political reality was forged in the chaos of those specific months. Thanks for watching this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and we'll see you next time.